April 15, 1945. A prison camp on the Rhine. The war was almost over, but for the women behind the barbed wire, hunger still ruled every thought. They braced for punishment, for scraps of stale bread. But what drifted through the air was the rich smell of butter, coffee, and warm food. American soldiers carried crates, not rifles. Pots clanged, steam rose, and starving prisoners tasted something they never imagined: kindness from their enemy. One woman whispered after her first bite, "This is the best food I've ever had." What happened next would change everything these women believed about their captors, and about the world itself. Stay with us for this powerful, true story of mercy in the ashes of war. And if you want more untold World War II stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and support the channel. April 15, 1945. The barbed wire hummed in the cold wind outside a small Rhineland town. Inside the compound, rows of German women prisoners waited in silence. Their shoes were worn to threads, their faces hollowed by months of hunger. Every sound echoed in the emptiness: the creak of boots on gravel, the hiss of a pot lid, the clang of a ladle against metal. Then a smell drifted across the yard, rich, almost sweet: coffee, butter, warm bread. It was a smell no one expected in a prison camp. The women moved hesitantly toward the makeshift kitchen. A mess line of young American soldiers in khaki uniforms opened crates and stirred steaming pots. These soldiers had grown tired of their rations. They joked about Spam being more punishment than meal. They rolled their eyes at powdered eggs, cornbread, and endless tins of peaches. But for the women watching, the sight was staggering. Here was food in quantities and textures they had not seen in years. One woman reached out for a slice of white bread. Her hand shook as though she feared it might be pulled away. She pressed it to her face, inhaled the yeasty warmth, and took a bite. Tears welled in her eyes. Around her, the line of women ate in silence, chewing slowly, reverently. Then she whispered the words that would echo through the camp: "This is the best food I've ever had." It was a paradox too sharp to ignore. The very men who had defeated their nation, who stood as symbols of humiliation, were also the ones filling their empty stomachs. For the American soldiers, it was just another distribution of rations. For the prisoners, it was revelation. The camp guards noticed. A sergeant scribbled in his pocket diary, "They lick the plates clean. I've never seen people so grateful for Spam." Another GI from Iowa shook his head. "They treat it like caviar. What soldiers dismissed as barely edible, the prisoners received as a banquet." That evening, the sounds of war seemed far away. Inside the wire, the rhythm of spoons scraping bowls and cups clattering against tin was louder than the distant artillery. Hunger, the oldest weapon in war, was being disarmed not by treaties or speeches, but by coffee and bread. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality, and it was only the beginning. The paradox of that April morning did not end with the first taste. Beneath the steam of tin cups and the hiss of butter melting on cornbread lay a reality of numbers, the arithmetic of war that determined who starved and who survived. For years, German civilians had endured rations that dwindled with every month of the conflict. By 1945, the average German diet had sunk to around 1,000 calories a day, often less in bombed-out cities where distribution collapsed. Bread was stretched with fillers like sawdust or ground potato. Meat disappeared. Coffee was a bitter substitute brewed from acorns. Mothers bartered heirlooms for potatoes. Children foraged weeds and nettles from ruined gardens. By contrast, the United States Army was a machine of abundance. Its Quartermaster Corps churned out millions of KE and C ration packs designed to deliver 3,000 calories per soldier per day. In 1944 alone, America shipped more than 100 million individual rations across the Atlantic, a logistical miracle carried on Liberty ships. The irony was that many GIs grew sick of the sameness. Canned meat, processed cheese, powdered drinks. They longed for fresh eggs or fruit, while their enemies, now prisoners, regarded the same cans as treasures from another world. One German woman prisoner later recalled, "I had not tasted real butter in 3 years. When I spread it on bread, I thought it was a dream. The soldiers laughed that it was only margarine. To me, it was heaven." The wire between captor and captive became a line of contrast. On one side, American soldiers dumped uneaten cornbread or spam onto trash heaps. On the other, women pressed crumbs from their palms to their lips, unwilling to waste a speck. The paradox deepened. What one side discarded as excess, the other revered as salvation. Yet these meals were not simply acts of mercy. Feeding prisoners served practical purposes. A well-fed camp was quieter, less likely to riot, less likely to spread disease. The U.S. Army's manuals stressed the importance of providing adequate rations to maintain order. But for the women on the receiving end, statistics and regulations mattered less than the first full stomach in months. At night, they lay on straw mats, listening to the gurgle of their own bellies no longer empty. The faint smell of coffee seemed to linger even after the pots were scrubbed. Hunger had defined them for so long that satiety itself felt like a kind of shock. But this was only the first transformation. What began as numbers and calories would soon become ritual, a rhythm that reshaped suspicion into trust and despair into survival. Morning in the compound began with sound. First the rattle of pots, then the heavy clang of a ladle against a kettle, followed by the sharp metallic ring of cups and cutlery. These noises, once ordinary in civilian kitchens, had become sacred within the wire. For the German women prisoners, food was not only sustenance, it was the heartbeat of the day. Each sunrise brought the same ritual. Lines formed quickly, women clutching tin bowls, their breath hanging in the chill. The Americans behind the serving tables moved with practiced motions, ladling coffee, scooping eggs, sliding slices of bread. Steam lifted into the damp air, mixing with the sour smell of smoke drifting from the town's ruins. Even the clatter of boots on gravel became part of the rhythm. The paradox of these meals could not be missed. These were women who, only weeks earlier, had been taught to see Americans as brutes, enemies who would starve or mistreat them. Instead, they were being fed with a consistency they could hardly believe. One recalled later, "At first I thought it was a trick. I waited for the food to stop, but every morning it was there, like clockwork." Numbers underscored the ritual. Each GI ration crate held enough to feed dozens, and in 1945, the US Army was distributing over 16 million rations daily across Europe. The sheer scale of this supply chain made possible what seemed miraculous to those behind the wire. The prisoners did not see the rail yards and cargo ships that delivered these meals, but they tasted the result: regularity, abundance, reliability. Slowly, the ritual began to shift moods inside the compound. The women who once stood stiff with suspicion now greeted one another with murmured jokes about who might get an extra slice of bread. Children of camp guards sometimes peered curiously at the lines, catching the aroma of cocoa or coffee and realizing even Isoners ate better than many civilians outside. Hunger was still a shadow, but it was no longer the master of every thought. The Americans noticed changes too. One private wrote to his sister in Ohio, "They line up neat as churchgoers, not a word until they eat. Then you hear a little laughter. The same girls who looked like ghosts now have colour in their cheeks." But the daily meal did more than fill stomachs. It wore away at the walls of fear and propaganda. Each clang of the ladle said something louder than words. The enemy had chosen to feed, not starve. Suspicion still lingered. Whispers of doubt, sideways glances at guards. Yet the rhythm of meals was steady, and with it came the slow return of trust. Still, another dissonance simmered beneath the surface. For years, the women had been told the Allies wanted their destruction. Now they sipped coffee provided by those same hands. The propaganda was unraveling. What they saw next would shatter their certainty even further. The war had been fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with stories. Nazi propaganda had hammered into every German ear that Americans were crude, greedy, and merciless. Posters showed GIs as leering brutes, enemies who would burn villages and starve women. Mothers were warned that capture meant degradation or death. Yet here on the banks of the Rhine, the women prisoners found themselves spooning butter onto bread handed to them by those very men. The paradox was unbearable. The people they had been told to fear were the ones who gave them life. One young prisoner remembered, "We had expected cruelty. Instead, they gave us food. I did not know what to believe anymore." The contrast was sharpened by memory. Inside Germany, rations had been slashed to the bone. In the winter of 1944–45, the Ministry of Food officially reduced civilian allowances to as little as 1,000 calories per day. By comparison, U.S. Army supply logs reveal soldiers overseas receiving rations worth 3,300 calories daily, often with leftovers discarded. The gap between myth and reality was measured in thousands of calories and in the look of astonishment on hungry faces. The Americans were equally struck. Sergeant William T., who later gave testimony to the Army's Oral History Project, recalled, "We'd laugh about Spam, call it the enemy. But when we passed it to them, they held it like gold. It made me realize how different our worlds were." Propaganda had painted a simple picture: ruthless conquerors against innocent citizens. Reality was more complicated. Some women in the compound had worked in Nazi offices or factories. Some had lost brothers on the Eastern Front. They were not naive, yet the daily meals blurred old certainties. Was the enemy truly a monster if he gave you coffee every morning? Even the senses rebelled against indoctrination. The hiss of coffee poured into a tin cup contradicted years of radio broadcasts warning of American barbarity. The sweet taste of canned peaches dismantled caricatures more effectively than any speech. Propaganda thrived on fear of the unknown. Abundance revealed the truth in every bite. Still, doubt lingered. Some whispered that the generosity was temporary, a trick before punishment. Others clung to Nazi slogans, even as they ate American bread. One German nurse scrawled in her diary, "I don't understand. Why do they treat us kindly? What do they want from us?" The answer was both practical and profound. The U.S. Army fed prisoners to maintain order and uphold the Geneva Convention. But in doing so, they also undermined the lies that had fueled the war. Each meal was unintentional propaganda in reverse, proof by taste, smell and touch that reality was stronger than ideology. And it did not stop with bread and coffee. Soon, small acts of personal generosity slipped into the daily routine. Chocolate bars pressed into hands, cigarettes shared, even spare clothing offered. These gestures would deepen the paradox further, bridging the wire in ways no broadcast ever could. It began with small things: a square of chocolate slipped across the wire, a cigarette shared in the dusk, a slice of cornbread saved from a soldier's own tray. What had started as regulation rations soon became something more human. Private James H., an infantryman from Iowa, described it in a letter home. "They treat Spam like it's caviar. One girl smiled at me like I'd given her a diamond just for handing over a candy bar. Makes me wonder what they've lived on all these years." His words echoed a broader truth. The Americans, weary of monotony, barely noticed the items that carried enormous meaning for the women. Chocolate was the most treasured. To an American soldier, a Hershey bar was part of a standard field ration. Energy in a wrapper, quickly eaten. To a German prisoner, it was sweetness remembered from childhood, something absent for nearly a decade. A woman recalled, "When I tasted chocolate again, I felt like I was not in war anymore. For a moment, I was a girl before bombs and hunger." The paradox deepened. Soldiers joked about tossing away unwanted corned beef hash, while women carefully folded the wrappers of candy and tucked them into pockets as keepsakes. These small exchanges carried weight beyond calories. They were gestures of humanity, unrecorded in ledgers but unforgettable to those who received them. Numbers again tell the contrast. The US produced over 600,000 tons of rations in 1945 alone, enough to feed armies and still spill into occupied zones. By comparison, German agriculture had collapsed under bombing. In some cities, official surveys recorded residents surviving on 800 calories per day. The gifts soldiers handed over casually represented a gulf of industrial might, as much as kindness. Not all Americans approved. Some officers warned against fraternization, fearing that too much kindness would soften the authority of occupation. Yet the line was hard to police. A soldier who watched a prisoner lick her bowl clean often could not resist sliding her an extra spoonful. Humanity seeped through the cracks of regulation. At dusk, when guards smoked by the fence, laughter sometimes drifted from the compound. Women compared notes on the strange foreign tastes. The saltiness of Spam, the sweetness of peaches, the strong bitterness of American coffee. These sounds carried across the wire, and GIs found themselves listening, realizing their enemy had voices, jokes, even moments of joy. The ritual of food was no longer just about survival. It became a fragile bridge. A loaf of bread was still a loaf of bread, but in the silence of a camp, it was also a message. The war might not erase every trace of mercy, but these small acts raised a question that even the women themselves struggled to answer. If the enemy could be generous, then what had all the years of hatred and fear truly been for? That question would only sharpen as official reports and records confirmed what the senses had already learned, that the abundance was not an accident, but policy. Behind the steaming pots and the kindness of individual soldiers lay a system. The food was not improvised charity, it was organized policy, documented in ledgers and monitored by inspectors. Feeding prisoners was as much a logistical operation as moving tanks or ammunition. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners of war receive the same standard of food as the detaining power's own troops. The US Army took this obligation seriously, not only out of law, but from a desire to maintain discipline. The Quartermaster Corps calculated rations with precision, ensuring that even in the chaos of 1945, daily deliveries reached the camps. Records show that an American POW camp meal plan in Germany averaged 3,200 calories per prisoner per day, a figure astonishing when compared with the starving cities only miles away. The International Red Cross confirmed these disparities. In inspection reports filed in spring 1945, officials noted that American-run camps were distributing meat, bread, potatoes, and even occasional fruit to prisoners, while German civilians outside the wire were surviving on ersatz substitutes and black market scraps. One delegate wrote bluntly, "In some districts, POWs are better nourished than local populations." This created a striking paradox. The women in captivity were safer, better fed, and more secure than many free citizens of the Reich. Letters smuggled to relatives sometimes carried a guilty confession. "I eat better here than at home." The abundance also had a practical purpose beyond nutrition. Well-fed prisoners were less likely to attempt escape, riot, or spread disease. In 1 month alone, the US Army distributed over 200,000 pounds of flour to POW camps along the Rhine, not only to maintain order but to prevent epidemics in overcrowded compounds. Food was discipline disguised as generosity, yet the effect went deeper that enum policy. For the prisoners, the meals contradicted everything they had been told about their enemies. For the Americans, it was an education in power, that feeding could sometimes accomplish more than force. An officer overseeing supply noted in his log, "The food line is worth 10 guards. They queue, they wait, they eat, and there is peace." Still, the irony was sharp. Outside the camp fences, German civilians scavenged bombed-out streets, trading jewelry for bread. Inside, prisoners were measured ladles of coffee and slices of cornbread according to official charts. The war had inverted logic. Captivity brought security, while freedom offered hunger. This dissonance would soon take on an even larger dimension, for as the war drew to its final day, food was not just filling stomachs. It was reshaping identities, preparing a defeated people for a future they could scarcely imagine. On May 8, 1945, the paradox of plenty in the shadow of ruin would reach its most profound moment. May 8, 1945, VE Day. The war in Europe was over. Church bells rang in shattered towns, though many rang from cracked towers or makeshift scaffolds. Across the Rhine, bonfires lit the night sky. But inside the barbed wire compounds, the celebration was quieter, carried not by trumpets or parades, but by the same ritual sound, the clang of ladles on kettles, the hiss of steam rising from pots. For the German women prisoners, surrender was a moment of disorientation. Their world had collapsed in an instant. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years had lasted barely 12. They were captives, enemies of the victors. Yet when dawn came, so too did the bread, the butter, the coffee. One prisoner wrote in her notebook, "I thought today we would be punished. Instead, it was the same as yesterday. Food, warm and plentiful." The paradox could not have been sharper. On the very day of Germany's defeat, when bitterness might have spilled into vengeance, the Americans maintained the rhythm of mercy. Even as German cities reported official rations at as little as 800 calories per person per day, POWs behind the wire continued to receive more than triple that amount. The arithmetic of defeat revealed a strange truth. Those who had lost were now being sustained by those who had won. The symbolism was not lost on the prisoners. One woman later recalled, "On VE Day, I realized the Americans had no reason to be kind. They had already triumphed, yet they fed us still. It was then I understood the war was truly finished." For the soldiers, too, the day carried reflection. A corporal from Illinois observed in a letter home, "Strange day. War is over, but I spent it handing out food to Germans. Funny thing, it felt more like peace than victory." Such testimonies reveal how the simple act of feeding blurred the line between conqueror and caretaker. Yet the generosity was not sentimental. It was calculated, rooted in the understanding that starvation would breed unrest and that order required nourishment. Still, the effect on morale was undeniable. The women no longer queued in fear. They queued in expectation, sometimes even in gratitude. Hunger had been replaced with a fragile trust. The camp routine on May 8th looked much like April 15th, yet its meaning had shifted. The meals no longer represented only survival. They symbolized the first gestures of reconstruction, the fragile beginnings of a world without the war. But the larger reckoning was still to come. Feeding one prisoner was an act of humanity. Feeding an entire defeated nation would be an act of policy, one that would shape Europe's future. The question was no longer whether prisoners would eat, but whether mercy could be extended to millions. By summer 1945, the barbed wire camps began to thin. Some women were released to ruined villages, others remained for months more, but all carried with them the memory of something they had not expected: abundance in the hands of the enemy. One recalled later, "We had come to hate them as monsters, but I tasted their food, and I saw they were men." The paradox was stark. These women had once lived under a regime that glorified scarcity, sacrifice, and struggle as virtues. Nazi propaganda insisted that Allied soldiers were brutes, intent on humiliation. Yet behind the wire, the most common sound was not shouting but ladles striking kettles, and the most common smell was not smoke or blood but coffee and stew. The contrast eroded illusions more effectively than any leaflet dropped from a plane. Statistics only reinforce the magnitude of that paradox. In 1945 alone, US forces shipped over 17 million tons of food and supplies across the Atlantic. An occupying force, capable of destruction on an unprecedented scale, was simultaneously orchestrating the largest relief effort in human history. American farms, with their mechanical harvesters and endless acres of wheat, fed not only their own armies, but also the civilians and prisoners of their enemies. This was not propaganda. It was reality, and it carried consequences beyond survival. For many Germans, the first seeds of post-war democracy were planted not in lecture halls or political offices, but in kitchens and mess tents. Abundance softened suspicion. Coffee cups and soup bowls replaced bayonets as the daily symbols of American power. The women remembered the texture of it all: the creamy melt of butter, the heaviness of white bread, the sweetness of chocolate, luxuries that wartime Germany had stripped from their lives years before. One wrote, "It was the best food I ever had because it was not just food, it was," as the proof that our world had been built on lies. As months passed, gratitude mingled with shame. They had once cheered for conquest. Now they depended on the generosity of those they had sought to destroy. This reckoning was painful, but it was also transformative. It marked the beginning of a new identity, from subjects of the Reich to citizens of a defeated but rebuilding nation. They had come as captives. They left as witnesses, and the lesson they carried would echo for decades. America's greatest weapon had not been its bombs or its tanks, but its ability to feed both friend and foe alike. In the end, they had come as conquerors. They left as students, and history would record the truth. In 1945, the true symbol of victory was not destruction, but abundance.